Today we're talking about the sanctuary and the bodily temple. It is still this first metaphor for understanding the relationship of God to humanity in terms of health. My friend no longer calls himself a Seventh-day Adventist, and he has always eaten meat, but we're sitting in a nice French restaurant, and he asks about a certain dish, and I realize that he's asking if it is clean or unclean meat. Well, he wants to shun oysters, it turns out, crabs, shrimp, but he's open to sole and flounder because they're equipped with fins and scales. And he ignores animals that have cloven hoofs or chew their cud. Now, he has a PhD from a top-flight university. He works on the cutting edge of his profession, but he can't put a morsel past his lips that he's been brought up to understand as unclean. It's not totally surprising. The last thing to go in any religion is ritual. Those actions where we are recognizing the difference between the sacred and the profane, the pure from the impure, the clean from the unclean. And so even if people have questions, increasing questions about whether God exists, they continue practices that they regard as ways to recognize that the body is the temple of God, or at least the way they used to understand it, as the temple of God. So we have these practices that were originally adopted as ways to recognize that God is with us and ways to recognize that God is sacred and to distinguish between the sacred and the profane, the clean and the unclean. Now this goes back to the early days of Adventism, and here I am still talking about the days in what we have called the first period of the years of ferment. These are the years after the Great Disappointment of 1844 until the turn of the century, 1901. This period of years of ferment is where the whole emphasis for understanding the relationship of our beliefs to health can be understood as falling primarily under the concept or the metaphor of the temple. Now, this was not something that was held by Adventists alone. There were revivals that were going on, as we looked at the last time, in 1844, where there was a camp meeting, and people were really filled by the Spirit and were bubbling over with emotion. The Methodists were revivalists in England who had come to the United States, and they had helped to bring revivals to the United States, including New England, where the Puritans had been pretty staid, pretty formal, but the Methodists came in and had these camp meetings and revival meetings, and they appreciated emotion at those times. And because of the theology and thinking of John Wesley, who's the founder of the Methodists, they felt that there was a kind of sanctification, presence of God's Spirit in their lives in a special way. And you remember we talked last time about the whole idea of entire sanctification. That was a term that the Methodists used, and extra holiness. There was a fellow named Ethan O. Allen who wrote a book called Faith Healing, and he said that purification from sin would eliminate illness. Purification from sin would eliminate illness. So this whole idea that God's Spirit would so dwell within you that somehow sin would be crowded out, and the result would be what? Something as concrete and tangible as health would be the result. Well, that was a parallel to what the Bible talked about, namely God's Spirit among human beings in the temple. And the Spirit of God so filled the temple that pollution was crowded out. And of course, there were efforts to keep the Israelites from impurification and to make them more pure and that way more healthy. There was a fellow named R.L. Stanton, former president of the Miami of Ohio University. He was also not a Methodist, but a moderator of the Presbyterian Church, that is to say, one of the key leaders of the Presbyterian Church. And he had some of the same ideas about if the Spirit of God was with you, that would transform your body. He said the atonement of Christ lays a foundation. The atonement of Christ lays a foundation equally for deliverance from sin, and for deliverance from disease. So holiness, God's Spirit, comes and crowds out sin, and it crowds out disease. Now, these people were talking in the 19th century. Ellen White, in 1863, when she had that major health vision, which we've talked about before, major health vision of 1863, she contrasts a church service where people in other denominations, non-Adventists, come together, contrasts that with the tabernacle, the sanctuary in the Old Testament. She says, instead of the cloud of incense filling the house, as in the case of the ancient tabernacle, it, that is to say, the house of God, the church, is filled with the sickening, polluted odor of ejected spittle, that's tobacco, ejected spittle and quids, and the air breathed by the congregation is poisoned. So the whole idea that God's Spirit is in the sanctuary is combined with the idea that God's Spirit is in our body as a temple. And what pollutes the sanctuary pollutes our body. Now, the experience of Adventists went along this way until about the 1890s. And then something happened that showed how this sense of God's presence coming in worship of Him, but also having an effect on the body, arose not in New England, where we see it in the earliest times of ferment, around the 1850s, 60s, and so on, but in the 1890s. What had happened is that the Seventh-day Adventists had moved their center of gravity from New England and then over to Upper New York State, which had been called the Burned Over District, as I referred to before, because there were so many revivals that really brought enthusiasm, and one revival after another. And the Adventists moved from Upper New York State out to Michigan. Now, we think that that's still roughly the east of the Midwest. But at that time, before you had railroads crisscrossing across the whole country in depth, in that time, Michigan was out on the western side. Well, the Adventists started the Western Reserve Institution, and it was the place where John Harvey Kellogg, the second generation of Adventists, came to be, at age 24, the head of that sanitarium, as he came to call it. He was somebody that had received a health reform certificate, but he went on also to get an MD in New York City, and at Bellevue Medical School. It was one of the best medical schools in the country, and so the Adventists put him in charge. Well, this is after the whole sanitarium had been established. In 1890, this revival with the Spirit came to Battle Creek. So on Friday evening, on a June 6, 1890, the Friday evening service was prolonged. Why? Because there were two women named Sister Parmalee and Sister Marks who began imparting the Holy Ghost, they said, by laying on of hands. They cast out devils, they felt, and they healed 11 people. The service went on until 3 a.m. on a Friday evening. Saturday morning, Sabbath morning, they reported on all this in the Battle Creek Church. Now that was probably the largest church in Adventism. Battle Creek was not only the place where this sanitarium was placed, but it was also the headquarters of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It was the place where the publishing of Adventist publications was centered, and it was through Adventist publications that the whole church had grown. So what we're talking about is that in the headquarters of the denomination, on a Friday evening, there were 11 people who were healed, not through the use of medicines, but through the bringing in of the Holy Spirit upon them. And there was a report the next day, appreciatively, to the headquarters of the whole denomination. Well, the next year in August 1891, the same thing happened, this time in the state of Ohio and the state of Illinois during camp meetings. And A.T. Jones, who was by that time becoming and had become the editor of the Adventist Review, he said, "The power of the Lord is present to forgive, to cleanse, as in temple, and to heal." And he referred to the situation in Ohio, says, "The large tent was nearly full and the whole congregation was weeping, many of them aloud and praising God. Oh, it was wonderful," he said. And 15 people were healed. Now, what was the response there at headquarters? And you have a person, John Harvey Kellogg, who has his MD, right? And he doesn't know what to do because he really thinks that this is a terrible way to go. Well, as had happened when there had been these miraculous healings in the 1850s, two Adventists who experienced faith healings died. John Harvey Kellogg talked with Jones, A.T. Jones, and W.W. Prescott, who was a leader of the Adventists there in Battle Creek. He had an M.A. from University in New Hampshire. And he worked with them and convinced them that they ought to move their emphasis from miraculous healings to health reform. He also, by the way, Kellogg, fired two of his staff physicians who had told people, you don't have to get medicine. You should be getting your health by healing miracles. So John Harvey Kellogg moved fast, and the result was a rather practical one. W.W. Prescott, who was respected as an educator because he himself was educated, having gotten his, as I say, his graduate degree at Dartmouth, all schools should adopt a vegetarian diet, was a resolution that was adopted by a convention of educators there in Battle Creek. Now, who was this A.T. Jones? We said this is a saga of Adventism, and the saga is built around personalities to some extent. Now, we're looking at certain understandings from Scripture that were used by Adventists at different times, particularly in this time, the temple of God, but it's also by persons. A.T. Jones had been one of the young editors who had challenged the editor of the Adventist Review back in Battle Creek. A.T. Jones and E.J. Wagner had followed some Ellen White out to the West Coast and stayed there. They had helped establish a Pacific Press, not just the one that was back in Battle Creek, but another press, Pacific Press, and it brought out a journal called The Signs of the Times. And if any of you are Adventists, you will know that there was in 1888 a very important conference. And it was a conference that was dealing with righteousness by faith. And these two young editors, A.T. Jones and E.J. Wagner, who, by the way, had also gotten a medical degree from Bellevue, same place that John Harvey Kellogg did, they joined with Ellen White, and at the 1888 conference, General Conference back in Battle Creek, they proclaimed the importance of righteousness by faith. And they were opposed by the editor of the Review, Uriah Smith. They were opposed by Pastor Butler, who is the president of the General Conference. But with the cooperation of Ellen White, these two young men succeeded in changing the church's view so that it embraced in a way that it hadn't before the teaching of righteousness by faith, not by works. Well, eventually, after 1888, in the 1890s, Ellen White was encouraged to go to Australia. Now, some people later have said that she was banished, but she went to Australia as a missionary. And A.T. Jones became the person that was looked to as the one individual who knew best what Ellen White thought. Well, once he became the editor of the Review and Herald in 1897, excuse me, he started borrowing from other non-Adventist sources a lot of literature about the holiness movement. We've talked about the holiness movement. At this period, there was something called the Keswick holiness movement in England. And he started publishing the writings of Hannah Whitall Smith, last name is Smith, a prominent holiness writer, and he reproduced some of her writing in the Adventist Review. He also ran ads for her that advertised her book. And in 1898, we're now getting down towards the end of this period of ferment. In 1898, he writes an editorial. And this is what he said: perfect holiness. Now he's using terms from this general revival evangelical holiness movement. He says perfect holiness embraces the flesh as well as the spirit. It includes the body as well as the soul. So he's tying spiritual holiness with the body and with flesh. And then he says in this editorial, the Lord is preparing a people unto perfect holiness so that they can meet the Lord in peace and see him in holiness. So here is the recreation of the expectation on the part of Adventists that they will walk soon into heaven, and that they can only do that if they receive perfect holiness in the body as well as the soul. So that's in 1898. In 1899, there was a series of lectures given by E.J. Wagner, the old friend of A.T. Jones, on the gospel of health. He, after all, as I said, was a physician as well as a person who had edited one of Adventism's major journals. And he was tying the same thing together, holiness and the body. He says, if the life of Jesus is made manifest in our mortal flesh, disease will be around us, but it will not hold us. Disease will be around us, but it will not hold us. So one delegate was trying to see if he really believed that. And he said, do you ever expect to be sick? And Wagner responded instantly, no, I expect to live forever. Now this was, you can imagine this idea that you could have God's Spirit and God's holiness, and the result would be that you would have a purified body, and that meant you wouldn't have to die. Luther Warren, who is revered by people who know anything about the history of Adventism as the pioneer in establishing work for young people, he said the same year, 1899, the seal of God, that is to say, the stamp that allows you to be assured that you are saved, cannot be placed on any person of gray hairs or any deformed person. And that's because before greeting Christ at the second coming, quote, we would be freed from all physical deformity and then could not die. So here you have some of the leaders, noted leaders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, becoming very carried away or inspired by these events, in Friday night meetings where people are healed, camp meetings, and now it's taken to the General Conference session. Perhaps the person who pushed this the furthest was a man named F.R.S. Donnell, two N's, an E, and two L's, Donnell. He was president of the Indiana Conference. And he said the cause of God's forsaking humanity as his temple must be removed before he can return and again occupy it as was his purpose from eternity. This removal was wrought when Christ became incarnate in human flesh and becomes incarnate even in your flesh and mine. Conversion is only incarnation going right on, God being manifest in the flesh. So, in other words, conversion is a step on divinizing human bodies. I teach that those who fully appropriate the power of the gospel of Christ need not to die. Now, this is the high watermark of the idea of health as being the presence of God in our bodily temple. And that healing is the purifying of this bodily temple so that God can fill that temple completely. Now, there was a man named S.N. Haskell who had known Ellen White in Australia. He was an American, and his wife came back, and they were writing to her about all of these phenomena. And she writes in 1900, this is just the same time that Donnell was saying what he said, and a year after the General Conference session, and the 2 years from the time of the editorial by A.T. Jones. She writes, no encouragement should be given to this kind of worship. She's writing back to Haskell in 1900. The same kind of influence came in after the passing of the time in 1844. They talked about holy flesh, they said they were beyond the power of temptation, and they sang and shouted and made all manner of demonstrations. These men and women were not bad, but they were deceived and deluded. So in 1901, she comes back from Australia to Battle Creek for a General Conference session. And she says that one reason that she returned from Australia was to declare unequivocally that the teaching given in regard to what is termed holy flesh is an error. So, from that time on, Adventists never took the doctrine of holiness and sanctification, never took the biblical metaphor of the body as the temple of God to mean that we would receive bodily perfection. and therefore we would not have to die. That was dead from that time on. It's, as you can see, if you look at your periods of Adventist history, this comes right at the end of the years of ferment. Now, there was another way in which Adventists understood the body as the temple of God, and that was when Adventists wrote about sex. And again, this was not unique to Adventists. There was a fellow named Larkin Coles, who was a Millerite. He was both a preacher and a physician, and he wrote a book that was sold 35,000 copies on the relationship of holiness and the body. Sylvester Graham, who was a Presbyterian preacher, was also a health educator, the man who developed graham crackers so that you could have grain as your major diet instead of meat. Sylvester Graham combined his roles of educator on health with Presbyterian minister. He said that each of us had a certain amount of vital force. Each sexual act depleted that vital force, and that things like alcohol, tea, coffee, spice should be prohibited because they excited the sexual passions. And then if you had too many sexual acts, that depleted your vital force. 1848 and in 1854, you have with Ellen White an identification of tobacco as well as tea and coffee with pollution of the body, which increased the possibility that you would have passions and that would result in sex, and that would result in a diminution of the vital force. In her famous or long essay following her vision in 1863, her health vision, this is her first principal health vision in 1863, she wrote a book called An Appeal to Mothers. And a lot of it had to do with the problem of masturbation, or as it was called in that time by not just her, but other devout and Christians, self-pollution. Self-pollution. She said, those who corrupt their bodies in this way must repent, and, quote, their Christian character must be without a blemish, or they will be pronounced unfit to be taken to a holy heaven, to dwell with pure, sinless beings in God's everlasting kingdom. So there's the idea of an everlasting kingdom, but it's combined with the idea that we are to have pure bodily temples that fit with the temple in heaven. In 1868, 5 years later, she brings out a second edition of Appeal to Mothers, and here she talks not just about self-pollution, but she talks about marital sex and says that that also can be a means of corrupting and polluting the heavenly, not the heavenly, but the bodily temple. So it was this metaphor, this way of understanding the relationship of God with our bodies was very important during this first period that we call the years of ferment. After 1870, Ellen White wrote little about sex. And about this time, John Harvey Kellogg became the major figure who articulated for Adventists a view of the importance of purity and understanding our bodies as a bodily temple. He was a part of what has been called the purity literature of the 19th century. The purity literature. And this was literature that combined discussions of health with discussions of morality and theology. In 1877, John Harvey Kellogg, at the age of 25, 2 years out of Bellevue Medical School, working to establish the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and it had been called the Western Health Reform Institute. And he stayed there for 40 years. But he was a young man of 25, and he produced a book called Plain Facts About Sexual Life. Plain Facts About Sexual Life. It was brought out in another edition, a revised Plain Facts for Old and Young. Now, Kellogg continued to write on this topic. There were other books like Ladies' Guide in Health and Diseases, Girlhood, Maidenhood, Wifehood, Motherhood. Now, when you put all of these books together, John Harvey Kellogg in his lifetime, writing on this topic, the idea of the bodily temple and how we kept it clean, how we keep it clean, how we keep it holy, sold over 1 million copies. He was one of the major writers of this sort of literature. Now, he understood himself to be moderate on this, because there were some people that said you should only have sex in order to produce a new life, not just for pleasure. And then there was somebody like Sylvester Graham, this Presbyterian minister who was also a health educator. He said, well, you probably have sex one time a month. Kellogg refused to say how often, and he refused to say that sex was only for procreation. It actually took the 20th century, where we're down in the years of consolidation, the 20th century when academic Adventists changed the view officially, not officially, but in fact, of the Adventists, so that they felt, they argued, and they succeeded in making it acceptable to regard the sexual act as an expression of love, not something that might drain away your energy and allow you to pollute your body. For example, Harold Shryock, who was a professor of physician here at Loma Linda University, wrote Happiness for Husbands and Wives, and he said this, to just support the generalization I made. He said, sexual expression represents the culmination of all the desirable features of the family situation, the ultimate in marital happiness. Sexual expression is the ultimate in marital happiness. And he wrote other books like On Becoming a Man, On Becoming a Woman. And there are many young Adventists that were given the facts of life, so to speak, through these books. And these took a very positive view towards sex and not assumed that it was very easy for that to become a pollution of the bodily temple. Charles Witcheby was a professor at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary. He wrote a book on God Invented Sex. And then there was a woman here, Alberta Mazat, who for many years wrote books like That Friday in Eden and Fullness of Joy, that was making the point that sex is not something that we should primarily view as a pollution or an occasion for pollution, might be, but the main thing about sex is that it was a gift of God for the enjoyment of his creatures. So, you have the importance of the presence of God and a kind of taking of that to the point where, well, the presence of God in the bodily temple is going to transform that temple, that bodily temple, so that you can go straight to heaven and feel that you are appropriately in the temple in heaven. This metaphor was also one that we've just seen was something that the Adventists wrestled with, because sex at the beginning, in the 19th century, was understood as a danger to this bodily temple and its holiness given to us by God, to the point where it was a very appreciated form of God's presence in the joy that it brings to husbands and wives. This whole metaphor of the bodily temple and the sense of God's presence with us, and that is a very good biblical way of understanding. But how you translate it into health is complicated, right? That shows up in diet. And that's the last thing I want to talk about with you today about this question of the bodily temple. Now, the whites had a struggle with diet reform. You remember that we had other Adventists who were, first of all, people who had embraced health reform. Captain Joseph Bates is the main person that I introduced you to that had that view. He later became a Seventh-day Adventist. The whites, who were co-leaders and founders of Adventism with Joseph Bates, their experience was very early, particularly Ellen White, because she was so young, with the Millerites, with the experience of God's presence and the excitement of that. And then they started seeing the implications for health reform. We'll see in a few weeks how it is that health reform was introduced to these Adventist, post-Millerite, and increasingly Seventh-day Adventists because of the health problems that they had. But the whites came to understand the importance of the bodily temple in terms of diet gradually. Now, yes, Ellen White in 1848 and then in 1863, she said, oh, we should not have tobacco, we shouldn't have tea and coffee, etc. But as far as diet itself was concerned, they, for example, had a hard time giving up meat. And there are stories about how Ellen White and her husband advised people in 1850, only 6 years after the Lord didn't return, 6 years after the Great Disappointment. They say, we do not, by any means, and this is written out, believe that the Bible teaches that the proper use of pork in the gospel dispensation is sinful. So they kept their pork. And so it wasn't until about 1864 that Ellen White gained the victory over pork and said, no, they didn't want to have any more. She was still wrestling with something like oysters in the 1880s. Now, 1870, she started turning against meat, but as I say, it went until the 1880s or so before she could really gain the victory over meat. In 1870, she said meat should not be placed before our children. Its influence is to excite and strengthen the lower passions, and instead, quote, grains and fruits prepared free from grease and in as natural a condition as possible should be the food for the tables. Why? Should be the food for the tables of all who claim to be preparing for translation to heaven. So, if you want to not have an impure bodily temple, focus on grains and fruits and stay away from meats and grease. The place where Ellen White finally took a stand against meat eating was in 1894. Why? Because in Australia, remember I said that she had gone down there in the 1890s? Some people said that she was urged to go by the brethren who didn't want to have someone challenging their views all the time. In any case, she was down there in Australia in the 1890s. And she was at a meeting, and she was stunned. This was a camp meeting in Brighton in Australia, when a Catholic woman fell to her knees in front of Ellen White, who had been giving a talk, and let her know that she admired her so much. But she said, would you please stop eating meat as an act of compassion for animals? And there was something about that experience that led her to say in a letter in 1894, I will no longer patronize the butchers. I will not have the flesh of corpses on my table. It's pretty vivid. I will no longer patronize the butchers. I will not have the flesh of corpses on my table. She came back to the big general conference, which we will talk about, in 1901. She came back from Australia. She helped A.G. Daniells, and I'll say this many times, transform the structure of the Adventist Church. And then she helped install A.G. Daniells as the new president of the General Conference. He wasn't officially called that until 1903, and that's why 1903 is the last period of the years of ferment. But she went on to urge A.G. Daniells in 1908 to make vegetarianism an obligation of church membership. She said that a pledge should be circulated throughout the Adventist Church where people, if they were going to continue to be members, would say that they no longer ate meat. Now, she was resisted by A.G. Daniells, this new leader of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the person that she had supported. We don't know all of the conversations that went on between them, but she reversed herself in deference to him. And in 1909, 1 year after urging A.G. Daniells to make this vegetarianism a part of the church, what it meant to be an Adventist, she reversed herself, and she said, we are not to make the use of flesh food a taste of fellowship. Now, we can conjecture why that was. I happen to think that it was the internationalization of the church. The church was growing overseas, not anywhere near the ways that it has in years after that. But already we were beginning to go overseas, and people outside of the United States had not had the experience with health reform that the evangelical Protestants had, particularly in the Methodist tradition in England and America. And so they were not people who naturally gave up eating of meat. It was also perhaps the fact that A.G. Daniells himself never gave up eating of meat. We don't know the combination of things, but that was the high watermark of the idea of the temple of God being someplace that shouldn't be polluted with the eating of meat. Now, Ellen White had to back down. In 1901, at that general conference where A.G. Daniells had been elected as president, she had said publicly, what I want is that every one of you should stand in your individual dignity before God in your individual consecration to God, that the sole temple shall be dedicated to God. Whoever defileth the temple of God, him will God destroy. So she really wanted it to change, but it didn't at that time. And it is the case now. It's hard to know exactly the prevalence of vegetarianism in the Adventist community, but at a general conference in 2000, only 30% of the delegates said that they were vegetarian in their life. So that's just a bit of an indication. There have been other surveys taken of Adventists, and it's 28%. So one way in which diet could very dramatically embody the way in which Adventists see health as being the presence of God in the bodily temple, and healing as being the purification of this bodily temple. That was not something that was adopted. Now, there was another way, and there is another way in which Adventists have tried to show that they believe that we should do some things to purify our bodies from corruption, because our bodies are the bodily temple, suffused by God's presence. And that is the distinction between clean and unclean meats. Clean and unclean meats. It's my feeling that the reason that in the 19th century this distinction between clean and unclean meats did not become general is because there was this drama of our becoming more and more involved in health reform, and there was the possibility that the Adventists would become vegetarians. And so in the 19th century, there really wasn't a thoroughgoing discussion and acceptance of the distinction between clean and unclean meats. Pork was virtually banned, and as we have seen, there was a discouragement of meat eating even by people like Ellen White, who continued to eat until 1894. Now, this distinction between clean and unclean meats, this didn't appear in the general principles of the Statements of Beliefs of Adventists of 1872. In 1875, there was another statement of beliefs, and the distinction between clean and unclean meats doesn't appear there. There was a very formal outline of our statement of beliefs that appeared in our church documents. It was never approved officially by the General Conference, but it appeared in our documents in 1931, and that didn't have a distinction between clean and unclean meats. The first time that this distinction first appeared was in 1951, the middle of the 20th century, more than 100 years after the Great Disappointment. And it appeared in the baptismal vow. And then in 1980, there was an official adoption of a statement of beliefs, the one which we basically have now. And that is that, there a distinction is made between clean and unclean meats. It is the only statement of beliefs that any Protestant Christian church includes officially. So why is it that that appeared? Well, I think that as it became clearer and clearer that the church would not adopt vegetarianism, there was more and more interest in this distinction between clean and unclean meats. There have been debates as to whether that's based on Old Testament Levitical laws or whether it's based on the basic laws of nature and health. And the latter is the one that has been most often emphasized in our time. But I think that instead of obtaining meat, we follow this distinction between clean and unclean meats, not only because we think that the laws of health demand it, but it is a certain kind of continuing homage to our founders who felt that the body was clearly the temple of God, as found in the writings of Paul. It is the homage that we give to the idea that our health is linked to God's presence in our lives. So that in our dietary restrictions and prohibitions, Adventists remain committed to ceremonies of health as the harbingers of the holy. Next time, we will start talking about the biblical concept of law and how that has been a way in which we've understood the relationship of God to health, and observing the laws as a way to restore health. Now, that doesn't mean that this symbol, as we've quite carefully gone through, didn't continue, and does, I believe, to this day continue. I think the idea that there's clean and unclean meats, as well as that we don't want to pollute our body with tobacco continues, and tobacco is the one prohibition that is almost universal by people who go to Adventist churches. You do not find very many people smoking in parking lots on Sabbath morning around Adventist churches. And we'll talk about the health implications of smoking. So this continues on, but we will be finding out that after Ellen White dies, in the early part of the 20th century, there is greater and greater reliance on law. Now let me just say a word or two about your assignments. Please do read your assignments. Not much has been assigned for you to read. There isn't a huge amount. But please read those. And then you don't have to write on anything but the assignment, but there's other readings for you to look at as well. Thank you. Bye.